That mechanism quietly is rewriting how a WTA 1000 tournament calculates who belongs on center court. To understand what is actually happening in Cincinnati, you have to look at what Eala arrives carrying. She enters the Lindner Family Tennis Center as the number 17 seed, world number 20 in the latest WTA rankings, and holder of a 7-1 record on the North American hard courts this summer. She is the first Filipino player ever to win a WTA Tour singles title, sealed less than 2 weeks ago in Washington, and she is walking into a draw that could give her Amanda Anisimova in the third round, Linda Noskova in the fourth, and a rematch with Jessica Pegula in the quarterfinals. This is the setup. This is what the tickets are being bought for. Here is what nobody outside the ticketing offices usually explains. When a WTA 1000 tournament builds its daily schedule, court assignments are not purely about seeding. They are about a quieter conversation between three groups: the tournament director, the head of ticketing, and the broadcast partners. Seeding tells you who is technically important. Ticket data tells you who people are actually paying to see. Broadcast tells you who will move television numbers in specific markets. When those three signals align, a player gets center court. When they conflict, someone in a back office has to make a judgment call. For most of the season, Eala's numbers on the pure seeding side told organizers to schedule her on outer courts. Her ticketing signals told them something completely different. That gap is where the story lives. Cincinnati is not the first tournament to face this. It is the third in a row, and each one has responded differently. In Washington, tournament chairman Mark Ein publicly greeted Filipino fans in person during finals week, thanking them for showing up all week. In Toronto, tournament director Carl Hale went further. Speaking to reporters after the Wednesday night sellout, Hale said, quote, "A sold-out Wednesday night this early in the tournament is really unheard of," end quote. Those are his words. Published by The Athletic on August 7th, that quote is not marketing spin. It is a tournament director admitting on the record that Eala's presence broke a pattern he had operated inside for years, and now Cincinnati inherits the same puzzle without the benefit of a large local Filipino community to absorb the demand. Fan estimates place the Filipino population in the Cincinnati metropolitan area at roughly 1,000 to 2,000 people, which is a fraction of Toronto's community. If ticket demand is spiking in Ohio the way social posts this week are claiming, it is not being driven by locals. It is being driven by fans flying in, driving in, and buying resale listings from other states. And that pattern, if it holds, is what changes the math for tournaments going forward. Start with the anchor number, the one that is fully documented. Toronto sold out its Wednesday night session in 30 minutes. That is not a marketing claim. That is Carl Hale speaking to The Athletic, describing what happened inside his own ticketing system when Eala's match was moved from the 2,800-seat grandstand to the main stadium. Volunteers who had been given Wednesday night tickets were asked to exchange them for future sessions because the demand had shifted so quickly. That is a WTA 1000 tournament, mid-tournament, restructuring its own volunteer allocations. That is the shape of the phenomenon we are talking about. Now, layer the second point on top of it. 2 days before Toronto, Eala had won the DC Open final over Jessica Pegula, 4-6, 6-4, 6-0. First Filipino WTA Tour champion in history. And in the immediate aftermath, tournament chairman Mark Ein did something you rarely see. He personally approached Filipino fans in the stands, thanking them for their attendance across the entire week. That gesture matters because Ein is not a sentimental figure. He is a businessman. Tournament owners do not make in-person appearances to specific fan groups unless the commercial impact has been substantial enough to warrant it. What that gesture told the rest of the tour, in the language tournaments actually speak to each other, was simple. This player is moving tickets. Prepare accordingly. Which brings us to Cincinnati and what the draw actually looks like on the ground. Eala received a first-round bye as the 17th seed. Her opening match is August 15th against Rus, the Romanian who advanced by defeating Magda Linette 6-0, 6-3. If Eala wins, she likely draws Amanda Anisimova, currently world number 10, in the third round. It would be their first meeting on tour. If she gets past Anisimova, Linda Noskova waits in a potential fourth round. Noskova has beaten Eala twice already this season, 6-2 and 6-0 in Indian Wells, and 6-2 and 6-4 in the Berlin semifinals. Every one of those names sells tickets independently. But the compounded effect, when they are all placed inside a single draw quarter with Eala at the top of it, produces the kind of demand signal that ticketing directors describe as quote-unquote unheard of. Let me pause here for a moment, because it is easy to lose the thread. This story is not about whether a specific dollar figure appeared on a specific resale site on a specific afternoon. That is what the viral posts are arguing about. The larger story, the one that actually matters, is about a business system inside the WTA that is adjusting in real time to a player whose commercial pull outstrips her ranking. That is rare. That is what makes this moment worth understanding carefully. The third layer of evidence is the one that lives on the ground, inside the tournament itself, and it is often the most revealing. In Toronto, one of the food vendors changed a menu item mid-tournament, replacing chicken teriyaki with a Filipino chicken adobo rice bowl in Eala's honor. That is not a marketing plan filed months in advance. That is a vendor watching the flag count in the concourse and making a call. Fans wore custom shirts printed with the words Rise, Believe, Inspire, signs in Tagalog reading Mahal Kita, which translates roughly to I love you, appeared above the courtside barriers. When Eala walked to her post-match microphone that night in front of 10,000 people, she asked for louder cheers in Tagalog before switching to English. Then she said, quote, "There are so many Filipinos in the crowd, so many flags, thank you," end quote. Those are her words, verified by The Athletic on August 7th. A tournament does not manufacture that. A player earns it, one crowd at a time, until the sport itself has to reorganize around the presence, and the sport is starting to reorganize out loud. That is the fourth point. Coco Gauff, speaking at the same Canadian Open, said of Eala, quote, "It is so great for the sport and great for all the players. It is great that one player can bridge the gap between a sport and a nation that had not had that representation before," end quote. Venus Williams, who partnered with Eala in doubles at Bad Homburg and again in Toronto, called her, quote, "a world star," end quote. Jessica Pegula, in her post-DC final press conference, called Eala, quote, "an amazing player," end quote, adding that she was, quote, "not fun to play against." These are peers. These are the people who feel the shift first because they are the ones watching a locker room recalibrate around someone new. The clearest voice in this story, though, is Carl Hale. He is the tournament director who lived the ticketing decision in real time in Toronto. His quote about the Wednesday night sellout being unheard of was not a soundbite. It was a working professional describing, with mild disbelief, a data point that broke his internal expectations. Behind that quote is a woman named Jason Maglante, who serves as head of ticketing for Tennis Canada. Maglante, who is Filipino, was the person who first flagged to Hale that diaspora demand was building around Eala's matches. He had been hearing from members of the Toronto Filipino community for weeks, and when the initial court assignment for Eala was set at the smaller grandstand, it was that internal ticketing intelligence that triggered the upgrade to center court. That is the mechanism. That is what actually happens inside a tournament when a player begins to outgrow her seating. It is not a press release. It is a phone call between the director and the head of ticketing with the demand data on the screen between them. Cincinnati has its own version of that conversation happening this week, and whether or not the specific resale numbers being shared on Filipino tennis pages hold up to independent verification, the underlying signal, the pressure that generates such posts in the first place, is exactly the kind of pressure Hale described in Toronto. It is the sound of a business system catching up to a player who arrived faster than the seating chart allowed. Zoom out for a moment and consider what this actually means for the sport. WTA 1000 tournaments compete with each other for signature narratives. They market their draws to broadcasters, sponsors, and cities. For decades, that competition has been organized around a handful of predictable stars whose commercial pull is priced into the ticketing strategy months in advance. When a player like Eala emerges outside that pricing model, tournaments have to adapt in weeks, not seasons. Cincinnati is watching Toronto's playbook in real time. The U.S. Open, which begins on August 24th in Flushing Meadows, is watching Cincinnati, and the Asian swing later this fall, when the tour visits Beijing, Wuhan, and Tokyo, will be watching all of it. The Philippines, a country of more than 110 million people spread across 7,600 islands, has never had a player like this in tennis history. Eala is not just the first Filipino to win a WTA Tour title, she is the first Filipino to reach the Wimbledon fourth round, which she did last month, upsetting defending champion Iga Świątek along the way. She is the first Filipino to hold a top 20 ranking, and her 9-4 record against top 10 opponents, verified by ESPN in their Cincinnati preview published on August 13th, tells you that these are not upsets anymore. They are results. That distinction, the one between an upset and a result, is exactly the distinction tournaments track when they decide where to place a player on the schedule. Eala has crossed that line, which is why the Cincinnati ticket story, even where its specific dollar figures are still being sorted out, feels different from a normal fan-driven surge. This is not a one-off Grand Slam moment. This is a business apparatus adjusting to a player who is now expected to move numbers everywhere she goes. None of this arrived without cost. Twice this season, Eala walked off court against Linda Noskova, having been dismantled. Indian Wells in March, 6-2, 6-0, a scoreline so lopsided it barely registered as a match. Berlin in June in the semifinal, 6-2, 6-4, closer, but still a clear loss on a surface she likes. Those two matches sit inside her season like markers, reminders that the version of Eala who wins WTA titles and the version who runs into a specific stylistic problem still exist inside the same player. Her response has been the only response that actually counts. Between those two Noskova losses and today, she reached the Wimbledon fourth round, beat Świątek, beat Fernandez, beat McNally, beat Pegula in a final, and climbed to world number 20. That is not a recovery. That is a reorganization. And it is why, if the Cincinnati draw does eventually deliver her a Noskova rematch in the fourth round, the ticket demand is not for a lock. It is for a fighter with visible weaknesses who is still climbing anyway. So place her, finally, inside the room she is now standing in. It is a room where a tournament director in Toronto tells reporters her sellout was, in his own words, unheard of. Where a tournament chairman in Washington walks over to a fan section in person to say thank you. Where Coco Gauff describes her as bridging the gap between a sport and a nation. Where Venus Williams calls her a world star at 46 years old with nothing to gain from the compliment. Where a vendor in Toronto changes a menu item mid-tournament because the concourse looks different when she plays. Where fans in Cincinnati